A woman kneels in a courtyard made of pale limestone, her back to the wall, her eyes shut, and her lips are moving. No sound comes out. A priest is watching her from across the courtyard, and he does not like what he sees. Her shoulders are shaking. Her mouth keeps forming words that never reach the air. He has seen this before, usually from men who have had too much wine at the feast. So he walks over and he says the cruelest thing you could say to a woman in the middle of the worst moment of her life. He tells her to sober up. She is not drunk. She is praying so hard that her voice has stopped working. Her name is Hannah, and you are about to learn what she was actually doing in that courtyard, because it is not what you think, and it is not what the priest thought either. There are more than 650 prayers recorded in the Bible. 650 times, someone, a king, a servant, a soldier, a mother, opened their mouth, or didn't, and spoke to God. And according to the people who have spent their lives counting these things, roughly 450 of those prayers have a recorded answer written right there on the page. This is not a trivia question. This is not a statistic to make you feel better about your own prayer life. This is not a Bible study fun fact for a church bulletin. This is 650 real, specific, desperate, joyful, furious, broken conversations between human beings and the God who made them. And by the end of this video, you are going to meet 5 of the people who had them. One of them is a man who will hear, with total certainty, that God has already said no. We are going to get to him. Not yet. First, you need to understand what Hannah was actually doing with her lips. The Hebrew word used to describe her prayer is shafak. It is a strange word to use for prayer, because its first meaning has nothing to do with words at all. Shafak means to pour something out: wine from a jar, blood from a wound, molten metal from a mold. It is the word you would use if you were melting wax down to nothing and letting it run out through your fingers. That is the word the Bible chooses for what Hannah is doing on her knees. She is not saying a prayer. She is pouring herself out until there is nothing solid left in her. You need to know why. For years, Hannah has wanted a child, and for years, she has had none. Her husband loves her, the text is clear about that, but he has a second wife, Peninnah, who has children, and who uses that fact like a weapon every single year at the family sacrifice in Shiloh. Year after year, the same trip. Year after year, the same humiliation. By the time Hannah reaches the temple courtyard on this particular day, she has nothing left to offer God except what's left after the wine has been poured out of the jar. So she prays without sound. She makes a vow that if God gives her a son, she will give him right back to a lifetime of service at the temple, the very place she is kneeling in right now. And the priest, watching her lips move with no voice behind them, assumes the worst. Here's what most people miss about this story. Eli could have walked away. He could have decided this wasn't his problem. Instead, after Hannah corrects him, "I am not drunk, sir. I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord," Eli says something that costs him nothing and means everything. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the petition you have asked of him." That's it. That's the whole exchange. A priest who almost got it wrong, and a blessing that took him 5 seconds to speak. And here is the detail that should stop you. The text says Hannah went home, ate a meal, and her face was no longer sad before she was pregnant. Before anything had changed about her circumstances at all. Something happened in that pouring out that settled her, long before the answer arrived. You know that feeling. The one where you've said the thing out loud, or even silently, lips moving. No sound at all, and somehow the weight shifts before the situation does. That is not your imagination. That is what shafak does. It empties you so God has somewhere to pour something back in. Hold that thought, because the next person you meet has no words left at all. Not even silent ones. There is a woman in the Gospel of Mark who has been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years is not a season. It is not a hard year. 12 years ago, somewhere in Galilee, something broke inside this woman's body, and it never stopped breaking. Under the law of her time, her condition didn't just cost her money, and it did cost her everything. Every physician, every treatment, until she had, in the words of the text, spent all she had and gotten worse, not better. It also cost her belonging. A woman in her condition was considered ritually unclean. That meant no temple, no full participation in her community. 12 years of being, in a very real sense, untouchable. So picture the crowd pressing in around Jesus that day, bodies on every side, dust in the air, voices shouting his name, and somewhere in that crush is a woman who has not been allowed to touch another human being, without consequence, for over a decade. She doesn't ask Jesus for permission. She doesn't call out his name. She reaches through the crowd and she touches the edge of his robe. And immediately the text uses that word. Immediately the bleeding stops. 12 years, undone in one heartbeat. But it gets stranger. Jesus stops walking. He turns around in the middle of a crowded street and asks a question that makes no sense to the people around him. Who touched me? His own disciples practically laugh at him. There are people touching him from every direction. The crowd is pressing in on all sides. How could he possibly ask who touched him? But Jesus isn't asking about the crowd. He felt something specific leave him. He felt power go out. The woman could have stayed silent. She got what she came for. Nobody would have known. Instead, trembling, she comes forward and tells him the whole truth. In front of everyone, the very people whose community she'd been excluded from for 12 years. And Jesus doesn't rebuke her for touching him while unclean. He doesn't even simply heal her a second time for good measure. He calls her daughter, the only time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus uses that word for anyone, and he tells her that her faith has made her well, not his power alone. Her faith reaching through a crowd with nothing but a fingertip and 12 years of desperation behind it. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about a statistic on a list of 650 prayers. This is not a story you can reduce to a single Bible trivia fact. This is a story about a woman who had no voice left to use, no standing left to claim, and one single act of reaching that counted as a prayer anyway. Because here's the truth underneath all 650 of these: not every prayer in the Bible is spoken. Some of them are a hand reaching through a crowd. Some of them are lips moving with no sound. What they have in common is not eloquence. It's desperation pointed in the right direction. There is a Greek word for prayer used throughout the New Testament, prosouche. It does not just mean talking to God. It carries the idea of a wish sent on purpose, aimed in a direction. Not words floating up into empty air. Words, or silence, or a single trembling hand, aimed at someone who is actually there to receive it. That is what the woman in the crowd understood. Even though nobody taught her the Greek, she did not need the right vocabulary. She needed the right direction. If this is hitting something in you right now, if you've been praying without sound for longer than you want to admit, hit subscribe before we keep going. Because we are about to meet 3 more people who prayed exactly like that. And one of them got an answer nobody saw coming. Here's the part nobody tells you about prayer in the Bible. Sometimes the answer doesn't come quietly. Sometimes it comes with a deadline already announced, and then God moves the deadline. But before we get there, you should know that not every prayer in this book gets answered on this side of the pain. There is a man named Job who loses everything. In the space of a single afternoon, his children, his wealth, his health, and prays through chapter after chapter without a single word of explanation from God. No angel, no quick reversal, just silence, and a friend's bad advice, and more silence. It is one of the longest unanswered prayers in the entire Bible. And when God finally does speak, near the very end, he doesn't explain the suffering at all. He simply shows up. Sometimes the answer to a prayer is not an explanation, it's a presence. Hold that next to what you're about to see, because it's about to look very different. There was a king named Hezekiah, and one afternoon, the prophet Isaiah walked into his room and told him to put his affairs in order because he was going to die. Not might die, not could die. Set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. That is as close to a final answer as anyone gets in the Bible. No ambiguity, no room for a different outcome. You would think that's the end of the story. A prophet of God just delivered a verdict. What is there left to pray? Hezekiah turns his face to the wall, not toward Isaiah, not toward his attendants, just toward the wall, alone with God, and he reminds the Lord of how he has lived. And then the text says something simple and devastating. Hezekiah wept bitterly. Pay attention to this, because the timeline matters more than almost anything else in this whole story. Isaiah delivers the news. Isaiah turns to leave. And before Isaiah is even out of the middle courtyard, before he's crossed the building, the word of the Lord stops him in his tracks. Go back. Tell Hezekiah, I have heard his prayer. I have seen his tears. I will heal him. 15 years are added to his life on the spot, before the prophet who delivered the death sentence has even left the building. 15 years. Added. After the verdict had already been spoken out loud. This is not a story about luck, or timing, or a king getting special treatment because he wore a crown. This is a story about what happens when grief and trust occupy the same prayer at the same time. Hezekiah didn't argue with God. He didn't demand an explanation. He wept, and he reminded God of the relationship they already had, and that was the prayer. We are going to come back to Hezekiah. Hold what you just learned, because there is someone else in this video who also hears a verdict and prays the exact opposite way. But first, you need to meet a church that prayed for one man for an entire night and then refused to believe God when the answer walked up and knocked on their own front door. This is the book of Acts. Herod Agrippa has already killed one apostle, James, the brother of John, and the crowd liked it. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades later, describes this same Herod Agrippa as a ruler obsessed with public approval, willing to do almost anything to keep the crowd on his side. That detail matters because it tells you Peter wasn't just a prisoner. He was a political trophy, kept alive only long enough to be executed in public. So Herod arrests Peter next, intending to do the same thing after the Passover. Peter is chained between two soldiers, with two more guarding the prison door, 4 squads. 16 men in rotation watching one prisoner. There is no version of this where Peter walks out on his own. Meanwhile, at the house of a woman named Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, there are believers gathered together, praying. The text says they were praying earnestly, all through the night, for Peter. And here is where it gets remarkable. An angel appears in Peter's cell. Light fills the room. The angel strikes Peter on the side to wake him up, not gently, and tells him to get up, fast. The chains fall off his wrists. They walk past the first guard, past the second. They reach the iron gate leading into the city, and it opens by itself. Peter thinks he's dreaming the entire time. He doesn't fully believe it's real until he's standing alone on a street in Jerusalem, free, and the angel is gone. So he does the only thing that makes sense. He goes straight to the house where the church has been praying for him all night, and he knocks on the door. A servant girl named Rhoda comes to answer. She hears Peter's voice through the door, and she is so overjoyed that she runs back inside to tell everyone, without actually opening the door. Peter is standing outside, free, and the people who prayed for exactly this outcome all night long tell Rhoda she's out of her mind. They had been praying for this, and when it happened, they didn't believe it. Peter has to keep knocking, again and again, while the very people who prayed him out of that prison argue with a servant girl about whether their own prayer actually worked. There's one more thing worth sitting with here. This story isn't really about Peter. It's about you, and about every prayer you have ever prayed so hard for, and then doubted the second it showed up wearing different clothes than you expected. The church got exactly what they asked for, and their first reaction was disbelief. 650 prayers in this book, and this might be the most human one of all, because it isn't about God failing to answer. It's about people forgetting they were even allowed to hope that big. You can be a person of real, fervent, all-night faith, and still be the one telling the answer at your front door that it must be a ghost. Now you need to meet the one prayer in this entire list that did not get a yes. It is the night before Jesus is crucified. He walks into a garden called Gethsemane with 3 of his closest friends, and he asks them to stay awake with him, because, in his own words, his soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Not sadness, not stress, sorrow that feels like dying while he is still very much alive. He goes a little further into the garden alone, and he falls to the ground, and he prays the most honest prayer in the entire Bible. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. This is not a calm, composed, theologically tidy prayer. The Gospel of Luke tells us his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground, a real, physical, medical response to unbearable stress that doctors have a name for even today. This is a man asking God with his whole body for a different ending. And remember Hezekiah. Remember the king who heard a verdict, you will die, and prayed, and watched God reverse it before the prophet had even left the room. 15 years added on the spot. Jesus prays in that same garden with that same kind of desperation, asking for the exact same kind of reversal. And this time the answer is no. The cup does not pass. The cross is still coming in the morning. But listen to the second half of his prayer, because this is the part that changes everything. Yet not my will, but yours be done. This is the one prayer in our entire list where the answer is no. And it might be the most important prayer in the whole Bible, because it proves something about every single one of the other 649. Prayer was never a transaction where you say the right words, and God is obligated to hand over the outcome you asked for. Hannah poured out her soul and got a son. The bleeding woman reached out and got healing. Hezekiah wept and got 15 years. Peter's church prayed all night and got an angel at the prison door. And Jesus, in the garden, prayed with more honesty and more agony than any of them and got silence, followed by a cross. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about a verse you can memorize and move on from. This is not a story about prayers that work and prayers that don't. This is a story about a God who, when the answer had to be no, sent his own Son into the garden to feel the full weight of that no, before any of us ever had to feel it alone. You have probably prayed a Gethsemane prayer yourself. Maybe you're praying one right now. Maybe you're sitting in a hospital waiting room with your phone in your hand, having already said the same 4 words 100 times tonight, please. God, not this. Maybe the answer you're waiting for hasn't come, and you're starting to wonder if it ever will. Here is what the garden tells you that nothing else in this video can. The no you might be facing is not evidence that you prayed wrong, or that you didn't have enough faith, or that God wasn't listening. Jesus prayed perfectly, with a perfect heart, and still heard no. What carried him out of that garden wasn't a different answer. It was the same trust Hezekiah had when he turned his face to the wall, the trust that comes before the outcome, not after it. So here is what 650 prayers actually teach you. First, prayer in the Bible was never about perfect words. Hannah didn't even make a sound. The bleeding woman didn't say anything at all. What God responded to every time was honesty pointed in his direction, not eloquence. Second, an answered prayer is not always a fast prayer, and a delayed prayer is not a denied one. Hannah waited years. Hezekiah's answer came before the prophet left the room. There is no pattern to the timing, only a pattern to the trust required while you wait. And third, the one I want you to sit with the longest, even when the answer is no. You are never praying alone, into silence, to a God who doesn't understand what it costs you to ask. Jesus has already prayed your hardest prayer before you did. He has already felt what it is to ask for the cup to pass and not get the answer he wanted. So whatever you are pouring out right now, lips moving, or hands reaching, or face turned to the wall, you are not the first one in this story to pray that way, and you will not be the last one God answers. Out of every prayer in this video, which one hit you the hardest? Hannah's silent lips, the woman who simply reached out, Hezekiah's 15 years, Peter at the door, or Jesus in the garden? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if you are still waiting on your answer tonight, keep pouring it out. 650 times in this book, someone did exactly that, and not one of them prayed alone.